Hey y'all, I'm Sunny Shell, and tonight Bree and I are talking with Chris Thompson. So sit back, buckle up, and let's get to the sunny spot on Skeptic Haven. Welcome everyone. Bree, you're looking lovely as usual.
Well, thank you. You as well. I just got off work, so I tried.
Me too. All I've done is change my shirt, so we're good to go. So, how's your week been?
Busy, which is good, but sometimes a little overwhelming. But I'll roll with the punches, as they say.
I am right there
Um,
with you, sister girl. I know exactly what you mean. Well,
yeah.
today we're going to be talking with Dr. Chris Thompson. So we're so glad y'all are spending your Thursday evening with us. So, Chris is an undergraduate at the University of Illinois Champaign Urbana, where he received a BS in ecology, ethology, and evolution in 2000. He earned his PhD in 2008 from the University of Washington in neurobiology and behavior. And this is something I'm really interested in. He was studying the effects of sex steroid hormones on seasonal changes in the song control system of songbirds. He worked with Professor Elliot Brenowitz at that time, and then he went on to a university in Germany, which I cannot say, but I just can't pronounce it. And he worked with Professor Constance Scharf, researching several aspects of the song control system. In 2011, he joined Holly Klein's laboratory at the Scripps Research Institute in, is it La Jolla or La Jolla?
It's La Jolla.
La Jolla,
Oh
okay, in
yeah.
La Jolla, California, focusing his research efforts on how thyroid hormones shape development of the visual system in tadpoles, and that is really interesting to me. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, Chris.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for having me. Yes. And currently, yeah, I'm at Virginia Tech. I've been here since 2016 is when I joined the School of Neuroscience here at Virginia Tech. And the university that I was at in Germany, so I was in Berlin, it's the Freie Universität, which I know it's got a little umlaut in there, so that's hard to say. But it's also known as the Free University in English.
Ah,
So yeah,
okay.
yeah. Yes, thank you for having me. Happy to be here, and you've got a long list of neuroscience questions we want to talk about. So
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
I'm happy to give a brief introduction to like a
Yeah,
little bit of the work that I do, because I know
absolutely.
part of what we talked about, like the main reason why I'm here is because there was a conversation I had with Aaron Raw that you saw, and then you're like, hey, like this might be interesting. I'd have this guy come on and talk about more about the brain and consciousness. And so I don't want to be like the consciousness guy, because I'm not. I'm pretending to be one more than anything else. I know an awful lot about the brain, and it turns out from like the last few weeks of me kind of reading up on consciousness and like the work in consciousness and the philosophy of consciousness, I'm finding out that there's a lot of people who work on consciousness who don't know a whole lot about the brain, which is super interesting. Now, neuroscientists who approach that question, they know a lot about the brain, but like a lot of even just philosophers talk about consciousness without like actually discussing the brain in any sort of respect, which is stunning to me. But anyway, a little bit about my research. So I actually focus more on the early parts of brain development at this point. So yeah, Sunny, as you pointed out, I worked on songbirds. I started working on how sex steroid hormones shape the brain circuits that regulate singing behaviors in songbirds, and we studied this in adults. So we were very interested in how changes in sex steroid hormones like testosterone, it'll surge in the spring and it'll act on these brain circuits and cause them to actually get bigger. And so, and this is generally going to be true in males. And then what my project was specifically focusing on is what happens when they transition from breeding to non-breeding conditions. So
Hmm.
when that testosterone goes down, once breeding season is over, then the brain, what happens to the brain? So it turns out it undergoes like substantial regression. And that's what my PhD focused on there. So
Hmm.
then I went to Germany, and then I got more interested. My work has always brought me like closer and closer to like the early embryo. So when I went to Germany, I was then more interested in the development of the song control system. And so I started to study how sex steroid hormones regulate some of the genes that are really important for developing the song control system. So it turns out the song control system in many songbird species is much bigger in males than it is in females. And, you know, how that comes about and why that is the case. Those were some of the things I was trying to assess. I ended up focusing more on this one particular gene that's called known as the language gene in humans, but it turns out it's also really important for song learning and songbirds. It's called FOXP2. So more stuff that I've done. But then I joined Holly's lab in San Diego, La Jolla. And I've no problem calling it La Jolla. I also thought it was La Jolla before I moved there. So, okay, it's La Jolla. Oh yeah, no, it's La Jolla, and so in Holly's lab she was studying the mechanisms that regulate the development of the visual system, and she's using an unusual animal model to work on this, which of course that's what I'm very fond of, is unusual animal models. So she works with the African clawed frog tadpole. And so I joined her lab with the interest of continuing my hormone work, but I switched from sex steroids to thyroid hormone. So I got a couple of slides and I can share these.
Yeah.
You'll have to, let's see. I will need to click this, and I guess I'd have to share my screen.
I'm sure Wes in the background can make sure it's working right.
I know this is the thing about Zoom here or StreamYard. Okay, so let me come back here and present screen. Okay, so it might take up a bunch of the screen, but that's okay. Okay, and actually I need to back up a little bit. So we're going to see my slides. Okay, Thompson lab in a nutshell. Hopefully, can be seen. Yes, great. So, what I study is brain development, and it's dependent upon a number of like specific kinds of mechanisms, right? So there's cellular and molecular things that there are cells in the brain that divide, and those are the cells that are progenitor cells. I'm actually going to get rid of that. There we go. So neuroprogenitor cells have these very kind of unique shape. They're located at the center of the brain, near the ventricles, and then they have these long processes that extend up to the surface of the brain. Now, these cells, they're called neuroprogenitor cells because they progenerate and they continue to make other cells, and those cells turn into neurons. And then, of course, these neurons, they have dendrites that need to connect to other axons that connect up. And that's what my lab is interested in. And we specifically study how thyroid hormone shapes this brain development. So I do this in tadpoles. So we work with the African clawed frog tadpole, and things that we can kind of do with them is it's really relatively straightforward and relatively easy to just treat them. We can just put them in a bath and then see what changes. And so this is like a little drawing of a very early stage tadpole. Now, why would we do this? What are we interested in thyroid hormone in tadpoles? Well, it turns out that thyroid hormone is the driver of metamorphosis in tadpoles. And so we can initiate metamorphic like change. Yeah. So when you give tadpoles thyroid hormone, you can initiate a pre-metamorphic process. So these are what control tadpoles look like. And this is what tadpoles who are treated with thyroid hormone, we call this T3. So thyroid hormone for just 6 days. So these are siblings. And you can see they're starting to turn into weird little frog-like creatures. So they've got little limb buds. You can see the tail is starting to regress. And then the gut is retracting. And there's all kinds of changes happening in the like orofacial region. So they're turning into little frogs. And these are sibling tadpoles. Like these guys were related to these guys. It's just that half of them were treated with thyroid hormone. So the circuit that I study, yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, so those tadpoles are the same age?
Yes, they're the same age. They're siblings.
Okay.
So that's the beauty of working with tadpoles, is that all you need is like a mommy frog and a daddy frog, and you put them together, and when they love each other very much, they make thousands of tadpoles all overnight. And so it's pretty amazing, and it happens super quick. So then they're all synchronized in development. And so, yeah, literally thousands of tadpoles that are siblings. So they have a similar genetic background, and they are they're synchronized in development for the most part. There's some variability, but yes. So they're all the same age. And those are siblings. Just when you treat them with thyroid hormone, you can induce these metamorphic like changes.
Wow, that's so cool.
So yeah, so this is what they look like. So the frogs that I work with are actually transparent. the adults are albino, and they look like weird demon frogs. So they have red eyes. They've got like kind of this pale white yellowish skin. They look like a weird albino creepy frog. But that makes the tadpoles entirely transparent. So what we're looking at here is a tadpole head. So this is one eye over here. Here's the other eye, and here's the entire brain. And they have all the same basic parts that every vertebrate brain has, including humans. The circuit that we study is the optic tectum. So that's the area of the brain that receives input from one eye, and then the other eye synapses on the other side of the brain. And so if we zoom in, what we see that same circuit that we were talking about earlier. So there's contralateral eye axons that synapse onto these optic tectum neurons. And then the optic tectum, what this does is that it takes retinal input. So there's a map of the retina within this area of the brain, and then it coordinates with other sensory input that comes into the brain, and then there's motor output that can come away from that. So they use this circuit for either getting away from predators, or getting away from looming objects, or also for schooling, for seeing where the other tadpoles are at. So, and they have to coordinate themselves. They have to coordinate their body with like the visual input. And this is the circuit that does this.
That's so cool. That is so cool.
So this is some.
Is my signal bad, or
no? I think that's on Dr. Chris. You're kind of going in and out a little bit.
We're roboting a little bit, yeah.
Let's go up here. Attack. Yeah, oh. Sorry. It's getting a little chunky.
There you go. You're starting to come back to us. I thought for a minute he was.
There we are. Okay. Yeah, I think one cool thing. So the other thing, actually, I'll back up a little bit. So one thing that we do in my lab is that we can take the brain and then we inject DNA into the ventricle. And this DNA is built to have a little fluorescent molecule that we take from jellyfish. It's called green fluorescent protein. So this DNA will allow us to label cells in the brain, in the living brain, so we can electroporate them. So we have these platinum electrodes that we put on either side of the brain, and we shock the brain. And then what happens is that, so if we're just looking at one side of the brain, right, we got these neuroprogenitor cells and you have these neurons. With this particular DNA structure that was built in my old lab, in the Holly Klein lab, one thing that we can do is that you'll get some cells that'll get labeled, and it'll be just the neuroprogenitor cells that are labeled. And then over time, they will differentiate and turn into neurons. And the thing is, like, not every cell is going to be filled. So it's only going to be some cells that are filled. And so we can put them under the microscope and image what these cells look like. And so this is a brain that was electroporated in my lab here at Virginia Tech. So here's one hemisphere of the tectum. Here's the other hemisphere. And you can see that there's axons going across. And the thing is, this is in a live tadpole. So this was a tadpole that was put under a microscope. It was anesthetized. And then we imaged it. And it's not just a flat image.
Oh, we're losing you again, Chris.
Actually, the image so close. The video there. All right, I'm going to escape there. So hopefully some of that came through. So what I was showing was some of the video that I'm able to do. I've got that video on my YouTube channel, so you can look at it if they really wanted to. But I think my internet is struggling with the video. So
yeah,
and that what that was demonstrating was basically stimulating the production of neurons.
Yes, basically. I mean, so we can monitor how kind of. So we can monitor over time in the same tadpole. We can look at a neuroprogenitor cell, these baby cells that divide and turn into neurons. The daughter cells will turn into neurons, and we can monitor them over time in the same tadpole over time. So we can do it in the living brain. So we can image directly into their brain and reconstruct what all this looks like in 3D. And so then when you add in thyroid hormone, well, one thing that does is it accelerates division of the cells in the brain. It it also enhances that process of those cells turning from neuroprogenitor cells to neurons. So so this is like a lot of stuff that I didn't talk with Aaron about. It gives me an opportunity to talk a little bit about my research. And then also it sets up the framework that, like, yes, clearly I am not like a consciousness guy, because like we're not going to really talk about consciousness in tadpoles per se, but I do know an awful lot about the brain. And I've been, I've become so interested in this topic. I'm preparing to teach a class on this, on consciousness.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So because there's an awful lot out there that is like just core misunderstandings about consciousness.
Yeah,
So,
and I think we're going to hit some of those questions
right.
When we get to that. But we do have one question really quickly before we get off of this particular subject. What happens if some of the NPCs die?
That question. So that's actually something that we're kind of working on right now. So I'm looking at how lead, which is the metal, right? How lead poisoning impairs those neuroprogenitor cells. There is a certain level of toxicity that can happen with enough lead poisoning. It's surprising how little we actually know about lead poisoning in the brain. Like lead poisoning has been an issue for decades. We've known since the 60s that it impairs and causes, brain development issues, and it lowers IQ in children that are exposed to lead. And yet we still don't have like a whole ton of studies on how lead affects the developing brain. So I have a graduate student who's working on this issue on how lead affects the thyroid hormone mediated neurogenesis. And some of what she's discovered is that if there's sufficient quantities of lead that a developing tadpole is at least exposed to, it will kill off some of those neuroprogenitor cells. And so if you lose some of those neuroprogenitor cells, what you're losing then is that population that is needed in order to make sufficient numbers of neurons to fully populate the brain as it develops. And if you lose that population, well, you're going to really struggle with having sufficient neurons in the rest of the brain, which means that you're going to end up with a condition that we call microcephaly, which literally means like small brain. Okay. So that's not good. Yes.
Yeah, that's not good at all.
No.
Wow, that's so fascinating. I think we could. It's like I'm so interested in this. I would love to continue on this line, and we might have to have you back again and just talk about that. It's very fascinating.
Yes, because we could talk about thyroid hormone in the brain. Yeah, because there's a bunch of research that I'm doing right now, and like we before the show, we're talking about thyroid hormone in the brain. I'd be happy to come back and talk about that. Yeah,
that would be awesome, because I had 1,000 questions, but instead we'll go with the consciousness. So. Our first question is consciousness in the brain or the soul?
Or the soul, right. All right. So I told you that there's a question that has to come before we answer this question. And that is, what is consciousness? Okay.
Or what is the soul too?
Sure. Well, then there's that. Well, I mean, again, I actually think that both of these things are just concepts, right? They require definition. And one thing that I found to be very frustrating when I am trying to learn about the way philosophers talk about this, and then of course, like the other side of people who want to create this dualism that occurs, right? That there's a set mind that is immaterial, and then brain material, or body that's material, and that the mind is separate from the body, but it has to interact somehow, but we're just going to know how. These are all things that I find to be very frustrating, because none of the terms are really truly defined. And I think that that's a big problem. So, and this is one thing, like, define consciousness. So like it's almost like that phrase from some famous Supreme Court case, like, well, I don't know how to define pornography, but I know it when I see it. It's a little bit like that, right? Like, well, we all know what consciousness is, but we don't really know it until but we can't really define it very well. And it's clear that philosophers struggle with this too. So yeah, how do you even define consciousness? We know that if someone is awake and talking and interacting, we say that they're conscious. If they go under anesthesia, we say that they are unconscious. Or if you get hit on the head, you become unconscious. And then, like, if you take drugs, like psychedelic drugs, you're in an altered state of consciousness, right? what does that mean? And then there's this issue of the subconscious. So all of these are terms that have fuzzy definitions, and they change depending upon the context. So that's the struggle that I'm having with in trying to wrestle with this issue at the moment, because I feel like the definition just gets flipped around. So in some ways, I feel that some philosophers define consciousness as those behaviors that humans make that neuroscience can't fully explain just yet. And it's almost as if it's like, okay, well, I'm just going to narrow my definition to whatever neuroscientists can't actually explain. That's a bullshit definition, but that's kind of what they work with. Yeah, it sucks. So, but I think more the fairer ones will say, okay, no, consciousness it's subjective awareness. So it is the perception that one involves self-reflection. So, but the thing is, like, awareness is something that we know an awful lot about. That involves perception, right? Our ability to perceive the world through our senses. And those kinds of things we know in incredible detail at the neural level. And we know that a lot of the brain is involved with that process of just perception. And learning more and more about like how sophisticated those levels of perception get as you go farther and farther up in the brain, away from just the raw senses. There's all kinds of processing and computation that comes on the different levels. Like as you go through the visual system, the early stages of the visual system are relatively simple in the kinds of visual stimuli that are needed to like cause neurons to fire. But as you go, and so when we're talking about neurons, just to bring everyone up to speed, right? Those are the cells in the brain that have, there's a cell body. They have dendrites that come out of that cell body like this. If I can do it with that, right? And then, so they're receiving inputs from other neurons. And then this one neuron will have then an axon that will connect out and go who knows where in the brain to connect to some other part of the brain, and will connect to other neurons, right? So that's just the fundamental unit of the cell of the brain, right? That's the fundamental cell of the brain. So, and neurons are connected to other neurons, right? We have neurons in our eyes that are connected to certain parts of the thalamus, which is called the lateral geniculate nucleus, and from there, those are connected.
Pituitary.
There's the pituitary, that's true, but it doesn't necessarily get input from the eyes, though. I know a lot about the pituitary. We can talk.
Oh, I was thinking pineal. Sorry.
The pineal. Yes. So actually, the pineal does get input.
Mixed up.
Yes. So, and the funny thing about the pineal, okay, I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but the pineal, you mentioned it, and it just triggered something in me. So
okay, go for it. That's why I brought it up.
We like being triggered like that.
Yeah, I'm triggered in a good way here. So the one thing about this whole issue around consciousness, obviously this has been like a philosophical issue, and getting to this issue about the soul, I think that historically and culturally and religiously, we refer to what the mind is and what consciousness is as the soul. Like that was basically what religious people would say, for centuries. But then Rene Descartes came along, and there were other philosophers before him that wrestled with this issue, but he really formalized this issue for modern philosophy, where he wrestled through these issues of what is the soul and what is mind and what is the body. And he wasn't like a kook. I don't think he was a kook. He was actually quite a brilliant guy, but he developed a way of thinking about logic and reason that was that still is kind of used to this day as far as philosophy goes. But he didn't know a lot, right? Because it was the 1600s. So he wrestled with this idea of like, do I even exist? And he knew he could think, so therefore he knew his mind existed. But then he was like, does my body exist? Do I even have a body? I think I do, but sometimes I dream, and then in my dreams I don't have a body. So maybe I don't have a body. Maybe this all is just imaginary. And so you can kind of see like, okay, those are actually some interesting questions. And he finally came to the conclusion that yes, he has a body. Congratulations, Rene Descartes, you have a body. But then he was struggling with this idea that there's an immaterial mind and it has to act on a material body. How does that happen? And so he knew a little bit about like the way the brain is structured. He knew that the brain must be involved with this. At that point, we knew very little about the brain, but we at least knew that it was pretty important for like having humans do stuff. And he kind of made this like logical conclusion that like, okay, the brain is mostly what we call bilateral symmetrical. It's basically the same on both sides. So if there's going to be like a central place that the soul, or I mean mind, excuse me, the mind needs to control the rest of the body, like a central place. And so he was focusing on what are things that you can only find one of them in the brain. And one of these things is the pineal gland. It's centered in the little part of the body of the brain. There's only one of them. And so he surmised that this was the central control point for the mind to control the rest of the brain, to control the body, which is not ridiculous. Of course, now we know that the pineal gland is mostly just involved in secreting melatonin, which is important for sleep cycles. So not really exactly controlling the whole brain as far as like being the central place where the soul comes in to control things. It's not going to be the puppet master area. That's the thing. There is no puppet master area. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but
Lepidostors made a lot better use of it than we did.
Dinosaurs did? Wait, what did you say?
It said Lepidosaurs.
Lepidosaurs
did made a lot more use of it. Yeah,
that's right. Yes, because it's the third eye. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, there's it's light sensitive in non-mammals, because it actually can have this function of operating as like a third eye, and it doesn't have the resolution that the two eyes do, but it can see looming objects, and it sits up at the top of the brain. And some animals, like the tuatara, actually has a pretty well formed third eye, which is their pineal, and
actually has a retina, I believe. Yeah,
and allows them to see if like it may even have a retina. I'm not entirely sure, but I know it's pretty sophisticated, and but it can resolve to some degree, like when a predator, like a bird of prey, is flying overhead, so it can just duck out of the way. So it doesn't have to use its two eyes. It's got a third eye up on top of its head. And then, of course, that's a great way for an animal to also kind of keep track of like, well, how light it is. And so then you can imagine for mammals through the course of their evolution that it was at one point entrained by the light of the day, and so as it becomes dark, then it would release melatonin. It would tell the animal like, okay, well, maybe it's time to sleep. But then it didn't need that light anymore directly to the top of the head, because we started to get these bigger brains and our cortex basically covered it up. So anyway, yeah, pineal is super interesting.
Yeah. So you said that that he was I think you said Descartes was
Descartes, yeah.
He was struggling with an immaterial mind, trying to communicate with the body.
Kind of.
And that kind of makes me wonder, can consciousness exist without the brain?
Right. So that's a great question. In my opinion, no. Because consciousness is an emergent property of neural activity. Now, could you conceive of some other sort of physical structure that could replicate consciousness? I suppose so. And that's one of the things with artificial intelligence, that the people are thinking that you might be able to recreate aspects of consciousness in silico. And I think that that's possible, because I think consciousness is largely just, it's at this point, we only know about it in neurobiological materials. And so therefore, clearly you need to have neurobiological materials in order to have consciousness. And they have to work right, because when you start to mess with it, well, then you start to disrupt consciousness. Many aspects of consciousness become disrupted when you start to mess and play with the brain. Now, but could you recreate some of the processes that look like consciousness in silico? I think that there's probably a chance that you could. I don't think that it'll be like human consciousness, though. And I also am very skeptical of the idea that you could take human consciousness and like upload it into, say, the web or something like that, because it's just so different that there's no way it might have some aspects of, say, like your consciousness if you were to able to upload it, but so much of our consciousness is dependent upon our perception and awareness, and all of that is substantiated in our brains and in our sense organs. And without those, like, well, what do you have? Like, you're going to lose the subjectivity that many, I don't know, I suppose philosophers think is so important for consciousness, which I get. Like the way I experience red, like that's the debate. Like, oh, I experience it differently than you, or is it the same? And right, how do we even know? Okay, I don't know. Some of these questions are just so dumb, but that's the things that philosophers really like to wrestle with. And I get that this is like the part where they talk about this is consciousness, like you having an internal feeling of qualia, of like, do you like red or do you like apples? Right. I suppose that's consciousness to some degree, that we can kind of agree that if I can think about, do I like apples and do I like red apples? I can see using that as examples of consciousness. But it requires taste receptors. It requires eyes to be able to see the way the apple looks and the color. And so if you take your consciousness and you just put it into a computer, I mean, at that point, then it's going to be a totally different entity. So,
well, we even see that with when people have parts of their brain that is damaged, it impacts. I mean, not even their personality, but it tends to impact their consciousness itself. I mean, it's like you were saying about if you like a red apple, you may have liked a red apple before you had a brain damage. Now you don't like a red apple. And so how does brain damage affect consciousness?
Yes. So in a number of ways. And actually, I think there's an awful lot that we can learn about what if we're going to have a working definition of consciousness. We can learn an awful lot about the way consciousness works by looking at unfortunate cases of brain damage in patients, or trying to manipulate or change these circuits in animal models, because it turns out animals have very similar structures, and we can still learn an awful lot from animals, even on these issues related to consciousness. So, for instance, although there's some limitations to that, and one of the major limitations, in my opinion, and I don't think I'm alone here, I've done some reading, and it turns out there's other like neurophilosophers who are thinking along the same lines as I kind of drew a conclusion to, is that one of the things that make humans unique in the animal kingdom is our capacity for language. And I do think that the emergence of language has unlocked aspects of our consciousness that give us the ability to ask these questions and to entertain the idea of consciousness. And really it's about language ultimately that gives us this capacity at all. So in order for us to identify objects, give them names, and to talk about how they interact with each other, you have to have language in order to do that and to have an understanding of it. Now, you don't necessarily have to have language to have some of that cause and effect relationship, because a lot of animals do. And that's why I don't think that consciousness is like exclusive to humans. I think it's advanced in humans, but it's a difference of degree and not kind when we compare like humans to animals, because clearly animals have some sense of cause and effect, or that they may reflect upon things before they act. They have the capacity to learn. They have the capacity to emote, right? We were going to talk about emotion.
And there's so much analog within the passerines that you did your early research on, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Even amongst birds, absolutely. They have very complex lives. They have the capacity to learn, enormous, like, for instance, there's some species of birds that are, like the mockingbird and the nightingale. They learn hundreds of different songs. And that capacity alone is extraordinary in itself. But then on top of that, there's the social interaction that they have with their offspring, with neighboring birds. They have to
ravens
learn.
And crows. Oh my gosh!
Oh yeah, and then you add in and actually that's another important point. So if you add in the corvids, which are passerines, corvids seem to have a particularly advanced sense of self. And there's this one test, because if one thing we want to look, we might say humans, well, they have self-reflection, they have self-knowledge, and animals don't. Well, of course, anyone who's kind of worked with animals knows that that's not exactly right.
Right.
But how would you even test that, right? Because I can ask you, do you have a sense of yourself? Like, yes, you would say that you do. And then if I put you in front of a mirror, you could look in the mirror and you won't see it as like some other being. You'll just know that it's you, right? So that's actually a test. It's called the mirror self-recognition test. And you can put animals in front of mirrors and you'll look to see, do they recognize themselves? And for a lot of animals, they don't. They either ignore the image completely or they think that it's some stranger and they will attack it. But when you take great apes, they do recognize themselves. And one way that we can test for this is that, like, you can take a chimpanzee and anesthetize it and then put like a little mark on its forehead that it can't see, right? Like if you would put a mark on its body, it would be able to see the mark. But if it's looking on its if you put it on its forehead, it won't know that the mark is there. And so then when the chimpanzee wakes up, and honestly, this is an experiment that's a lot like, kids in their 20s getting wasted and then they draw on the face.
Draw on the face.
Chud or something. Yes. It's basically the same experiment, but doing it with chimpanzees. So, but the chimpanzee wakes up, and if you put the chimpanzee in front of a mirror, what you look for is, does it do mark-directed behavior? And so if it is looking in the mirror and then it starts rubbing at its forehead, well, then you know that it has a sense of self. And you can do this with other animals, including the corvids. So there's been experiments done with magpies, which are incredibly smart. They very, they're a type of corvid. They're also quite striking. They're quite beautiful. But they can do mark-directed behavior. So you do the same thing with a magpie and you put it like down below where it can't see, like on its chest where it can't actually see it. And if you put it in front of a mirror, all of a sudden it's like, oh, what the heck is this? Yeah.
Self-awareness.
Yes, that's self-awareness. And then it can see its image in a mirror and know that that thing is me. Oh, and there's something on me. And it takes minutes for that to occur, which is extraordinary.
See, now we have an argument from embarrassment too. Gotta wipe that off.
That's right. Oh, man, I'll tell you. I mean, I'm kind of a big guy, you can see, and I certainly like food, and I'll like eat at my desk or something, trying to get some work done, and I'll go into the bathroom and look in the mirror and be like, oh my God, how could I eat like such a pig?
I've been walking around like that. Yeah.
Like, oh.
Well, it happens to us all. It's just saving it for later,
Yeah, that's what I'll tell people. But I have spare shirts in my office just for that purpose alone.
Now, didn't they do? I don't think it was the mirror test, but didn't they do something that even shows that like elephants have self-awareness?
Yes. No, it was the mirror test actually that they did with.
Okay, it was. Okay.
And they've done this as well with dolphins, and dolphins also show mark-directed behavior. So quite a few animals actually have this capacity, and not surprising, it tends to be the ones that are particularly social, the ones that have larger brain to body ratio, which is not like the most useful proxy for levels of intelligence, but in general what we find is those animals that are quite social and also show kind of advanced intelligent like abilities tend to have bigger brains relative to the rest of their bodies. Humans, of course, we do have the largest brain to body ratio, but elephants and dolphins, corvids, actually a lot have also very large brains relative to their bodies. So
parrots fall in that too, I think.
Parrots too.
Parrots.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Parrots also have very large brains. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think they do that. They're kind of self-aware and they have compassion and things like that. There's not a lot of brain activity and behaviors that are socially reactive that are unique to humans these days.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's one of the things about this topic. I totally agree with you that you almost every kind of correlate, any behavior that you're going to ascribe to consciousness in humans, minus complex language, right? Okay, yes. And you're not going to find an animal that's capable of the kind of language that we're able to do, at least on our good days. And it only applies to some of us.
I agree.
Right? Like when I hear philosophers talk about consciousness and like, oh, it's just unbelievable. I'm like, man, you've been out in the real world. Like, there aren't too many people out there that seem terribly conscious, I would say.
When I think about that,
but no, seriously.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Well, I was just going to say that makes me wonder how much of our brain, what percentage of our brain do we actually use?
Yes. Well, we do use use 100% of our brains. That is certainly true, but we're not using it all at the same time. And I confess that maybe not everyone's using their brain. That's for sure. I've certainly met some people where I've questioned that maybe there is 10% just for some people. Yes, no, the 10% brain myth obviously is not true. That's not like you're going to be able to unlock secret abilities if you could use more of your brain. But of course we don't use 100% of our brain all the time, because all at once, because that's called a seizure. So if all neurons are firing all at the same time, you don't want that to happen. Yes, because you might actually die. So yeah.
Yep.
You just
I
use
remember
it
being in high school hearing in high school about that 10% of we're only using 10% of our brain. I think I heard it was 5% or something like that. And I remember thinking, so how is that? What part of our brain are we not using them? Because you also learn that each part of the brain has different functions.
Right.
And it's like, so how is that possible? I could never quite figure that out.
No, it doesn't make any sense. Now, it might be true that at times maybe 10% of neurons are firing at any one time, but I don't know, I'm not even too sure where this myth comes from, because they're always firing to some degree, and so that is the thing. Like, you're always going to have this level of activity. Oh, I see that there's a comment here on corvids having sophisticated facial recognition. Yes.
Thank you, Apocalypse Meow, for the super chat.
That's a great.
And they hold a grudge.
Yes. So, believe it or not, some of that work on corvids having sophisticated facial recognition, that was done at the University of Washington. And I'm trying to remember the name of the professor that was working on that. It's escaping my mind at the moment. So this is the fallibility of consciousness, apparently, is that as you get older, like, you start to lose some of these things.
Was that when you were attending, or?
Yeah, so when I was at the University of Washington, some of this work was being done, and they used to use they would use these like Halloween masks to train the crows to either like resent this person or like this person. And I remember in the study, the bad mask was Dick Cheney. It was a Dick Cheney.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, it might have been biased, right? Because he's kind of a hideous person anyway. Just to look at. So
you don't even want to be his friend. He might shoot you.
Yeah, totally.
That probably gives you an idea around what time frame it was, though. The Dick Cheney Halloween mask. So
this was So I was there between 2000 and 2008, and so obviously. Yes, it was during that time, during the Bush years. Yeah. So I mean, again, showing like incredible abilities of corvids, right? So they have an amazing capacity to learn about their environment and adapt. And I know, like, if you like raise a corvid up early from development, you can even teach it to talk to some degree. So, right, like it'll basically talk like a parrot, like basically parroting certain words, but know that certain words mean certain things. So
that's fascinating stuff. There's a parrot that I follow called Apollo on YouTube, and he's knows like lots of names for different things, and they do little videos where he'll go through a list of things and tell you what they are. It's amazing how much retention they have in their minds. There's also a channel I follow where the corvids pay this woman in change that they find for corn.
Wow, that's fun. Yeah, that's hilarious.
She said she got one from like a euro. It's like, where'd you even get that?
That's
so funny.
So we had mentioned this earlier, or barely touched on it, but I'd like to ask, does consciousness have emotions?
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is a great question, because I feel like when philosophers talk about the issues around consciousness, that they mostly don't talk about emotions. which I think is a huge oversight, because I think that's a huge part of self and humanity is the emotional color that and that's a huge part of subjective self. I don't know why they mostly ignore this. Like when they talk about consciousness, it's all this sort of highfalutin, like, sense of the qualia and like, what does red look to you and to me? And it's like, like human beings are largely emotional creatures, and they want to pretend that like it's all about, E equals MC squared and thinking about the expansive space of the universe. And sure, those are great things that humans can do. But even I'm sure Einstein still fought with his wife occasionally, and like there were emotions there too. So, right, emotions are obviously a core part of humanity, but it's not exclusive to humanity either. Like the thing is, like we can find emotions in so many different animals, and that's the thing about. I think part of the reason why maybe they ignore it now at this point is because we know an awful lot about the neural circuitry of emotion, and so therefore, like, oh, well, clearly that's not consciousness. I think I don't know. I mean, I get the feeling that it is left out because we know so much about it. And so, but like, how is emotions not part of subjective self? I just don't get it. Like, do you have any idea? Like,
I don't. So my field is psychology, and that was one of the things that I did as my thesis was on emotion, and so that's kind of interesting. You can no matter where you are in the world, no matter even if you are in a remote village, there is emotion. It goes across. It's cross cultural. It's a part of the human experience. You can identify emotion from pictures. People identify. They know what emotion is. It's one of the tools that you can use to see if there is different psychological disorders like antisocial behavior and so forth. So it seems to me that it is exactly and directly tied to our consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Like your sense of whether things taste good or sense of self is going to be so directly tied to your overall emotional state. So I think consciousness has to include things like emotion, and I also think it has to include other things like, uh, I don't know why. I maybe I just haven't read enough of the literature, and maybe this stuff is in there, but I've yet to come across like some discussion. And I've only read a few of the articles at this point. I've seen a few of the lectures of some of the bigger names in consciousness, like lecturing and research. You can't call it research; they just kind of talk about it, right? So
Pontificating.
Pontificating, yeah, totally, yeah. But like identity, right? So like who you are as a person involves your emotional state, obviously, but like the things around gender as well, right? Like that's a big part of it, and that's completely ignored in this research, which is stunning to me given the issues around it, at least currently. But of course for decades we've talked about gender and identity, and right. So and how is that not part of this discussion? And I don't quite understand. I think again because like, well, that's also something we have some sense of the neural control of, and so but we don't have it fully worked out, but we know some of it, so it's just left out. I don't know. I think they just want to think the consciousness is like higher order thinking, but how is that not about subjective self? Right?
I agree. Absolutely. Absolutely.
That was one of the questions I asked when they mentioned that you were going to be talking about consciousness. So I was like, he's not a dualist, is he?
Definitely not. No, the whole dualism, I don't know. I've been reading about so there's a pretty well-known philosopher named David Chalmers on this topic. He does quite a bit of lecturing. He gets put on TV a lot, and he's kind of famous.
Oh, we're losing you.
Uh-oh. I think I'm back.
There you go. Yeah, as soon as you said that, we could hear you again.
Yeah. All right. Sorry about that. So yes, I was talking about David Chalmers and the philosophical zombie, which is it's this idea that, and maybe I have this wrong, but this seems so stupid to me. And then this is my understanding of it at this point. His idea is that if you could duplicate a human being down to the molecule of whatever state it's in at that moment, and have it just sort of be replicated right next to you, that person would maybe continue as acting as you are to some degree, but they would be missing your consciousness because you are still you. And so therefore that thing would not be a human being, it would be a zombie. And he goes through this whole sort of imagining what a zombie is, and can you imagine this, and could you imagine a being without sense of self? And that would be a being without a sense of self, I guess. And that would be, so therefore you could have a zombie, even though it's fully replicated with all the molecules in place. And to me, that seems so insane, because consciousness is ultimately an emergent property of the activity of neural networks. And if you could freeze a brain and the rest of the body in a particular nanosecond and duplicate it, well, at that moment, as soon as you unfreeze it, both beings are going to be experiencing exactly the same thing. And then pretty quickly, they're going to start to experience different things, but they will have all the same basic memory beforehand, because we know quite a bit of what we call the engram, right? Like, memory is stored in certain neural circuits, and we know quite a bit of how it's stored. Now, we don't know exactly, like, we can't look at a set of neurons and say, oh, well, that's your memory of your grandmother. But we actually can identify cells that are specific to grandmothers. We call them the grandmother cell. And these things have been identified in the visual system. So, like, we can't look at it a priori and say that's the grandmother cell, but we can record from neurons and find out that actually there are very specific facial neurons. Have you guys heard of the Halle Berry neuron?
No.
So this,
but I want to hear it.
This is an older study. So they were doing this in patients that were, so a lot of interesting neuroscience is done in patients that, like, say, have a tumor, and then when they're in the surgery, they wake them up, and then they're starting to mess with the brain, and they can do certain experiments with them if they're willing to be a part of it. So, and some of it is because that's part of how you have to do the surgery. So if you have a tumor in your brain, first of all, they can wake you up because, like, once you have everything open, that's the part that's going to hurt, but you don't have any pain receptors in your brain. So it doesn't matter if they play with your brain while you're awake, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about. Part of the reason why they're doing that is because, well, they don't want to pull out something that's really important. So they will probe and try to figure out, like, okay, well, what do you feel when I stimulate this? Or what happens if I stimulate this? But they did this one experiment in part of the brain called the temporal lobe that was part of the visual system. And so, as I was mentioning earlier about the visual system being additional layers of complexity, the temporal lobe is kind of farther down the chain of that level of complexity. And we know that this is an area of the brain that has, like, visual memory information. And so they were presenting stimuli to a patient, and they were recording from this part of the brain, and they had one neuron that they were recording from, and they were showing famous people's faces. So this was in the late 90s. So Halle Berry was pretty famous at that point, right? And so when they presented Halle Berry to this person, this neuron fired. And so, like, you could imagine, okay, well, maybe this neuron's sensitive to this particular shape of Halle Berry's face. But no, if they presented Halle Berry's face in other ways, the neuron still fired, like this way, or like in different kinds of lighting. Well, Halle Berry dressed as Catwoman also made it fire. So, like, it doesn't really look like Halle Berry, but this person obviously. And the crazy thing is, it also fired if they just presented the word Halle Berry.
Oh, wow.
So it was the concept of Halle Berry that made this neuron fire.
That's interesting.
Really cool.
Yes. And so that, like, these are obviously, like, neural correlates of consciousness. Like, this person has, like, a lived experience of having some knowledge of Halle Berry, you know, obviously has learned what her name looks like and learned that she was in Catwoman, and that there's a neural correlate to that. Like, and it's not ghosts that are doing that. It's just that we know that neurons can incorporate this kind of information, and that it's largely going to be visual for human beings, and sometimes it isn't, right? Like, and sometimes it's going to include auditory information. It's going to include, you know, sense of smell, right? Like, certain people smell a certain way, and you smell that smell and you're like, oh yeah, it reminds me of my grandfather or something, right? So yeah, and how all that doesn't get included in consciousness, I just don't understand. And so, like, if you take the zombie example, going back to what David Chalmers is talking about, like, okay, that individual, if that duplicate is going to have that, how could it not? Like that neuron exists in the quote unquote zombie. And I don't know. It's just so dumb. It doesn't make any sense to me. It's like Daniel Dennett is another philosopher who has written a lot about consciousness, and he's also written a lot about atheism too. Right. So he's a pretty interesting speaker and a really excellent writer.
Yeah.
And he is basically like criticized Chalmers a whole bunch. And so I've been reading a little bit of what Dennett has been writing about Chalmers lately. And one interesting thing that he had said is that like consciousness is sort of like looking at a smartphone. And if you were looking at the screen and you could see the stuff coming out of it, well, that's sort of like what we might think of what consciousness is. Like me talking to you, you can see that I'm conscious, but inside the smartphone, that's where all the stuff is happening, right? Like all the electronics and the speakers and the CPU that's in there, like all that stuff, that's the stuff that makes the smartphone actually work. And the philosophers, it's like they don't even want to know what's inside a smartphone. They just want to like look at the smartphone and that's it, and speak about like, oh, well, how does the smartphone know this? Well, there must be something mysterious about it. And to me, it just sounds like Ghost of the Gaps. We talk about God of the Gaps when we talk about science. This is Ghost of the Gaps. We're just
you're gonna get accused of scientism by that philosophy crowd.
I'm a dirty materialist and a physicalist.
Physicalist. Oh. Grab my pearls.
I know, yes. It's so tragic.
Here's an interesting comment I just saw in the chat. Is it possible you got a brain tumor and a tumor could increase your intelligence, inspired by phenomena?
Right. Phenomena with it was the name of the movie is Phenomenon with John Travolta. I remember that movie quite well. I have no idea. I know. Yeah, I don't work in cancer, right? I work with tadpoles, and so I don't know if this is like a real thing. That is a great question, and honestly, we were doing like a movie night at my university, and I didn't think about that movie, but that would be a good movie.
Oh, I bet there's lots of brain facts in that one. I haven't watched that since like the 90s.
I would imagine there's tons. Yes. Yeah, because that one also got pretty wooey with like mystery, sort of like, oh, what's going on? And like he's seeing angels or something. I don't know. I'm trying to remember the details, but then he ended up dying of the cancer. So sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah. Well, damn, I'm not going to watch it now.
25-year-old movie with John Travolta in it.
usually something dies in a John Travolta movie.
Yes,
so I'm curious, do you know a lot about the subconscious and perhaps how powerful the subconscious may be?
So this is the thing about then the definition of consciousness and then relative to subconscious. The subconsciousness, again, it depends upon your definition. If you're going to define consciousness as those things that we don't have adequate explanations from a neuroscientist perspective, well, then I guess the subconscious is all the stuff that I was just talking about. But that's not entirely fair. I think most people would agree that, if you're in tune with your emotions or you're feeling emotions, even though we know an awful lot about that underlying neuroscience, and I think many people would probably agree that that's conscious experience. The subconscious are those things that you're not necessarily aware of. So, there's an awful lot to say about the subconscious. One idea about subconscious experience is that those are those experiences that don't go through the thalamus. Now, I know that's a very neuroscience-y way of putting this, but it's because the thalamus is a part of the brain that gets a lot of the input senses, and then a lot of that input is then put to the cortex, and it does it in a very coordinated way. I think I may have lost you. So it does all of this in a very coordinated way, and then it relays from the cortex, which generally we kind of think of like conscious activity being in the cortex, the big part of the outside of the brain. But the thalamus is this part of the brain that is a relay station, basically. Now, one thing that's interesting is that there's only one sense that doesn't really go through the thalamus, and that's smell. So smell just goes straight to the cortex, and smell is one of those things that we often have a hard time placing it to memory. Like we know there might be a memory that like you smell something, you're like, that's deja vu. Like that's one of those senses where you really feel more deja vu. Like something reminds me about that smell and I can't really place it. Whereas you hear a voice of someone you know, like you immediately know that that's like grandma's voice, or you see them, obviously you can see them. And then even taste is gated through the thalamus, but smell is not. So like that kind of has qualities of what we might call subconscious, because it's this thing that's sort of lingering underneath the surface many times, and we don't necessarily recognize it as something that is so obvious. But it still is an important part of like experience and an important part of awareness and perception. So other things about subconscious would be, like the I would say our fight or flight response is very much like a subconscious activity that obviously has enormous control over our behavior. That is gated through a part of the brain called the amygdala. So the amygdala is Greek for almond, is what that means, and it's because it kind of has an almond shape. But the amygdala is a super fascinating structure. It gets input from a lot of the senses. So it's basically constantly monitoring the world. And if something is scary or frightening, well, the amygdala is just sort of like kind of the sentinel. It's constantly monitoring the world for things that are bad. If the amygdala senses something, then it'll trigger the fight or flight response. It'll activate the sympathetic nervous system, which is it's the peripheral nervous system that causes your heart to start racing, and like for your the butterflies in your stomach if you feel that, like when like a ghost jumps out at you at a haunted house or something. And then it also stimulates eventually the pituitary to stimulate the hormones that drive the adrenal glands to create corticosterone and cortisol, so the stress hormones. So like all that is a very powerful control mechanism that is always there. And you hear a scary noise at night, you're going to be like, whoa, oh my God, what the hell is that? Like, and so and it can take over right away. And then for some people, if that system is misaligned, like if they've got anxiety disorder, we often find that the amygdala is hypertrophied, meaning that it's larger. And so that means that the amygdala is mostly doing too much monitoring of the environment, and its threshold is too low, and so it can be triggered very easily. So yeah,
that's my field. So I work with children who have been abused, and so we talk a lot about this, because if you have adverse childhood experiences and they have not been resolved, your amygdala is firing constantly.
Right.
Everything is kind of triggering you.
That's right.
And so it's like we liken it to if you are crossing a street and there's a semi coming at you, and you're like, you kind of have that response. It's like everything in your world is a big semi coming at you.
That's
and
right.
How that that can impact so much of your health. Like people who have a higher adverse childhood experience score have a higher risk of heart attack, stroke, diabetes, weight gain. I mean, all kinds of different things besides what we typically think. And I'll stop there because I'll go off as you're talking.
No,
I'm like, oh my gosh, I could just
That's
go.
exactly right. I mean, it just echoes exactly what I was saying. And very obvious that the subconscious, if that's what you want to call it, is an important part of it. The other thing that I just learned, actually, that you might find this to be very interesting if you because clearly you know an awful lot about the amygdala. But I didn't know this up until a few weeks ago when this professor from Mount Sinai was giving a talk here at Virginia Tech. He studies the gut brain connection, and it's not through the microbiome, which is so popular right now in the popular science. Like literally how like neurons are connected to the gut from the brain, and specifically he looks at the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve is this big old nerve that comes down, connects to a whole bunch of different organs, but including the gut, and tons of interesting work that's related to that. But one thing he figured out is that there's this like part of this circuit that gets connected up into the amygdala, and then so it's a small part of the amygdala that's actually related to this. But he figured out a way that he can control the neurons in the amygdala by putting a receptor in there called an it's a channel rhodopsin, which is an optogenetic mechanism where you shine light on it and you can make the neurons fire in a certain way. So you make these neurons have this special channel, so now you can control it. And in order to get light in there, you put a fiber optic cable down into the brain near the amygdala, and then you can shine light, and then it just causes these neurons to fire. So now you can control this area. So he recognized that this area was connected to like the gut axis somehow. And when he stimulated this part of the brain, it caused the mice to automatically start eating. But like if there was nothing around them, they did what he called fictive eating. They would act like they're eating, but there was nothing there. So it'd be like mice normally grab things and then put things in their mouth. But as soon as you stimulate it, they just go, and then, yeah. And if there's something even inedible nearby, like metal, or if there's wood, which they don't eat wood, they will grab that and then start trying to eat it. So it's like, it's a specific food network. And so then for some people who have like obsessive eating or like uncontrollable eating, when they're not actually even thinking about, I've been there, you sit down after a hard day and you have a bag of potato chips and you start eating and you don't even think about it. I have a feeling that it's probably the same part of the amygdala that's being activated, saying like, oh, yep, just gotta keep shoveling that in, not even thinking about it. So that's unconscious eating.
Yes. There used to be, we used to think that people had oral fixations. So they would be chewing on a pen cap or had to have gum. And that's also related to your the word just went out of my head. Trauma response.
Yeah.
And so when you feel anxious, that's when you tend to chew on something. And it's the same thing that you're talking about. It's like, it's triggering that food response, even when there's no food around. And it makes you feel comfort.
Right.
It gives you a sense of comfort.
There's comfort.
So,
yes, because eating food feels good. And so of course you're going to have that oral fixation, and it's probably this circuit that we can trigger in mice that is probably present in probably all, at least mammals, and I'm sure it's true in humans too. Yeah.
Oh, this is so cool. This is the stuff that just gets me all excited, because it's the way that the brain works and the way the brain works and the way that that we respond to different stimuli is so flippin' ass cute. Cool. It's just so cool. Not cute, but cool.
I gotta
cute
agree.
Too, I guess.
Yes, I totally agree. Yeah. No, I feel very fortunate to be doing what I do. Like to even just spending time learning about the brain from other scientists and the experiments that they work on. It's so awesome. Yes.
I would love to do the work that you're doing. That would be so cool. Just being able to see how different stimuli affect the brain. Tadpoles, songbirds, it doesn't matter. Just anything with that is I would just be jumping out of my skin every day. I would be like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so like one thing about neuroscience is that there's an awful lot of work that's done just in rodents, rats and mice, and almost entirely mice. The reason why is because mice are, they're cheap. They're relatively easy to keep. They mature very quickly. It only takes about 60 or 70 days for them to reach sexual maturity. And then of course they're mammals. So, if you're going to pick a mammal, like, because we want to study how it works in mammals, translated to humans, that makes sense. So there's a lot of advantages. I'm not going to say that there isn't, but we're leaving so much on the table, right? Like we're not doing enough in neuroscience to learn how the brain works in animals that do unusual things and have like unusual or just different experiences or have evolved different kinds of structures. And that's the thing that, like, and there's some, I'm not going to say that there isn't, and we that's where the field of neuroethology, which is like considering the brain circuits that control behaviors that have say a particular fitness aspect to it, or can be used in a natural context. So things like echolocation in bats is a pretty commonly used example of neuroethology. And there's a lot of stuff that we've learned from bats too. So I don't want to say that we don't work on other animals at all, but like, the fact that we use tadpoles, it's because, well, there's certain things we do with them, but they have, aspects of their development and aspects of their life history stage that we can take advantage of and ask really interesting questions that you can't do with mice. And then with songbirds, right, they learn their vocalizations, whereas we know mice don't. So, yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And I want to talk about echolocation in just a second before we go onto that. I saw this in the chat and I thought it was really interesting. I think it's really cool how variants to the same stimuli produce different results, individual to individual. I do too. I want to know also about that. That kind of leads me into resilience and how some people have negative stimuli and they are resilient and others are not. They can be in the same family, have a lot of the same experiences, and why are some resilient and some are not? And that goes along with that. To me, it's a fascinating topic.
Absolutely. I totally agree. The thing about brains is that, yes, there's sort of this basic overall structure that we as neuroscientists learn. We learn that the motor cortex is adjacent to the somatosensory cortex that makes up part of the parietal lobe, and then caudal to that is the occipital lobe, which is the visual cortex, blah 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 blah. The thing is, there's variation between individuals. And any surgeon will know this, because when they have to go through the brain and they're looking at a particular patient and they're trying to figure out, like, well, okay, I don't want to take out their motor cortex because that's going to be pretty important for them. If I can find other areas that aren't part of the motor cortex, it's going to be in generally the same place, but it isn't exactly the same across individuals. So it's no wonder that, like, the same stimulus will have slightly different variation that will be experienced by each individual. And so, like, this issue of consciousness, when they talk about, like, subjective experience, well, there's a neural correlate to that too, that it can be incredibly subjective between brains. And then, so there are certain special circumstances where the structure of the brain can actually vary enormously between individuals. And it's actually related to this issue of echolocation.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What is echolocation?
Yes. All right. Good. I kind of led right into that. So, okay, echolocation, I bet most people know, but just to get everyone up on to speed, it is the ability to have a sense of your environment through sound. So for human beings and for most animals, we have two eyes and we can see our world and we know what that 3D world looks like just from our eyes alone for the most part. There are animals who are able to emit sounds, and then they can hear the echoes as it bounces off the 3D environment. And then that echo comes back to their ears, and then they can create a 3D representation of what the world looks like based on that echo signature. So there'll be a certain, like, if an object is relatively close, the echo as it comes back will be shorter than if it's an object that's farther away. And they can create a 3D space in their brains of what that looks like. Now, we know that dolphins and bats can do echolocation. Not all bats do, but dolphins can. And Bre, you mentioned that
hippos.
Yep. Yeah,
hippos
they all
do.
can do it too. So I know there are other animals that can echolocate. Mm-hmm.
Only in the water, as far as I know, though. So that's kind of interesting right
Yes.
there as well.
That makes sense. And I think that water is a great medium for echolocation because of the way sound carries through water. So you have much greater fidelity because the density of water is much higher than it is in air. And so, like, you really have to have some really specialized structures to do echolocation well in air. And of course, like, you can get specialization for animals that do it in the water. Like dolphins have very specialized structures too, but it's not quite level of sophistication that we see in bats. Like bats are really
whales do it with the melon, which the melon connects the same way, I believe, like into the ear system so that the sound travels through it. Bats don't do that, but they have the huge ears, right?
They just have the huge ears.
Sound.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's right. Yes, exactly.
So I got a question about that.
Yes.
With like, if it's pitch black and I'm in a room and I say something, I can tell how big that room is. Is that me using echolocation?
To some degree, yes. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, you can get a sense of like, okay, like, is this a big room or a little room? Just from that, like, yeah, we do use information from sound for sure. So there's sound localization that humans can do. And that the neural circuitry for that is super fascinating. It turns out that there's an interoral time difference. If there's someone, let's say there's someone over here on my right-hand side who's talking to me, I don't have to see them to know that they're on my right-hand side. Part of the reason why I know that they're there is because the sound is hitting my right ear before it's hitting my left ear. And we know the circuitry in the brain that allows us to calculate out precisely where someone is located in space. So if I even close my eyes, you can generally point out where people are in the room from just them talking, because we have this map. We have an azimuth map that it's like the way that this, because the time difference between sound hitting one ear versus the other ear is a difference of just milliseconds. But that's enough for neurons to work in order to make the difference and calculate that out, because it takes about 1 millisecond for a neuron to do an action potential. So there's if anyone wants to look this up, there's this model called the Griffiths model, and I think that there's an entire Wikipedia page on it that shows it pretty well. And it's a super elegant, beautiful way that it works. It was named after this guy named Griffiths, who developed this model in the 40s. He predicted that this is how the brain is going to be able to do location in space before we even knew that this circuit existed. And sure enough, it existed. And so we were able to demonstrate it later after he developed this model. So yeah, like delay lines and how you would have coincidence of activity from one ear and the other ear reaching a place that would say, oh, okay, this is where this person is located. It's super fascinating. I don't want to bore people with the circuitry though, but because it takes me like about an hour to explain it to my students.
That's the groundwork of echolocation though. I mean, right?
So exactly. It all kind of came from that area. And so yes, that is the groundwork for echolocation. So we all kind of have that ability to some degree, but we don't have the sense of structure. And this is the thing that I find is so fascinating. And this is where we can talk about individual differences. Not everyone is born with the same brain. And this is especially true if you're deficient in a particular sense. So there obviously are people who are born blind. They're congenitally blind. And there's a percentage of these individuals that they just sort of naturally gravitate towards doing echolocation, believe it or not. So these little kids, they will just click, like make little clicking noises with their mouth, and that no one teaches them to do this, but they're doing this because they can get a sense of their environment from making these little clicking noises. And there's a movement amongst some of the blind trying to say like, okay, the national blind organizations, their position is that kids shouldn't be doing this because it makes them look weird and they're going to be ostracized if they're wandering around clicking. But there's some people who say like, we should be encouraging kids to do this because it actually does give us the ability to have some sense of the environment, and that we don't necessarily need to sit here and just pretend that we're so completely helpless, because our brains are able to process some of this. Mm-hmm. And so it turns out that like the visual cortex in blind individuals, like, so that's one of the fascinating things about like the way the brain works across individuals who have different experiences than like what's neurotypical, is that blind people, of course, they have a visual cortex. Even if they don't have eyes, they still have a visual cortex. So what does it do? Well, it turns out that it's actually gets involved in language processing and auditory processing. And when a blind person is reading Braille with their fingers, the Braille, the part of the brain that's controlling this is the visual cortex. So it's as if they are reading Braille with the part of the brain that sighted people would normally use our eyes to read words, but they're using their fingers. And whereas
that's the neurons that are firing.
Yes, those are neurons that are firing there. And they've even experimentally blocked the activity there. So you can take something called a transcranial magnetic stimulator. So it's this device that you can put like in different parts of the head, and you can change the stimulation so that neurons don't work properly in that area. Like you can temporarily just shut it down. And if you do it in the back of the head where the visual cortex is, in blind patients that know how to read Braille, they can't read Braille anymore. But if you do it in the somatosensory cortex, which is like, that's the part that we use our fingers to touch. If you do this in sighted patients who know how to read Braille, they can't read Braille. But if you do that in sighted patients in the visual cortex, it doesn't affect their ability to read Braille because they're using their fingers to do it. And they're using, well, like a sighted individual would be using their somatosensory cortex, whereas blind people, they have like extra sensitive abilities for touch, for sound, for taste, for thermal perception, for like sensing hot and cold. All of their abilities are heightened relative to sighted individuals. And it's because so much of the human brain is dedicated to visual processing. And if we have eyes, well, okay, we're going to use our eyes for the visual processing centers. But if you don't have eyes, like, well, it's going to be used for other things. And the sense of where objects are in space, obviously, like a lot of that is informed by the eyes and sighted individuals. But for blind individuals, they have to use their other senses. So it's likely that, so when these blind individuals talk about using echolocation to see the world, they talk about like, I have a 3D sense of the world. Like, I don't know how to explain it to you because I've never been able to see before, but I know where things are in the world. So of course they have a similar sense because they have similar brain areas. It's just that they're using it in a different way.
Does it, because you talk about the reading Braille, is their tactile sense just in general enhanced, like the way that it's wired? So they build an image in their brain with the hardware that's not being used by the eyes to build an image. Right. That's so amazing.
Yep. So
blind individuals have a much greater tactile sense than sighted individuals. And the other cool thing about this is that for sighted individuals, tactile sense gets worse over time. So if you look at young individuals, they're still not as good as blind individuals, but they're pretty good. Like they can tell. It's called 2-point discrimination. So telling 2 points that are apart from each other, they can do that pretty well. And then as they get older, it gets worse. But for blind individuals, it stays completely flat. So like there's no correlation whatsoever with age. So if you look at like a 60 or 70-year-old blind individual, they will still be better than like a 20-year-old sighted individual. Whereas for sighted people, they start pretty good at 20. But then they just get worse over time, and their ability goes down.
There's a question really quickly. Could humans ever get the chemical senses that dogs do in their nose? Is it possible?
I would say no.
Maybe not everything is enhanced, right?
Nope. So
I like the way you answered that too.
Humans could potentially evolve the ability to have the sense of smell that dogs do. We would have to have selection pressure for that, and that's not to be expected. The apes in general and humans particularly, I know, it's sad. I see dang on there. We have much reduced olfactory abilities. We have a lot of pseudogenes in our genome that were olfactory receptors back when, tens of millions of years ago, when we had more of an olfactory sense than we do today. The amount of brain space dedicated to olfaction is a lot less. And our olfactory bulbs are really quite tiny relative to other mammals. And in dogs, they have huge olfactory bulbs, and their olfactory epithelium, and so that's the part inside the nose that has all the olfactory receptor neurons that are sensitive to smells, is I think 100 times larger than humans. So
why is our olfactory system so dedicated to picking up geosmins, though? The bacteria smell that you smell after it rains. I read something the other day that said we could detect that like 200 times or 200,000 times more sharper than a shark smells blood and water. I always wonder why now. Yeah.
I mean, I think that's kind of obvious, right? Like you would want to know if something has bacteria on it before you put it in your mouth. Right? You don't want to eat bacteria.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's the smell of like right after it rains, there's a bacteria that dies when it gets wet. That's what that smell is when you step outside after it rains.
Sure. Yeah. I think that it's related to that, honestly.
Yeah. To keep you from eating something that's bad for you.
Yes. Yep. Then it's like sure, we've lost the ability for sophisticated smelling compared to other animals, especially dogs. But but obviously we need some of it, and some of it can trigger some pretty intense emotions in us. So, and bacteria smell is one of them for sure. And so I wouldn't be surprised if that's an atavism that's held over.
So we have about 5 minutes. You had told us before that you can stay for an hour and a half, and I want to respect your time. So in the 5 minutes that we have left, do you have any closing remarks that you want to make? And also, what's going on in you? I mean, what's coming up for you? Are you speaking on any more channels? What kind of research are you doing? Do you have any publications? Anything like that?
Right. Great. Thank you for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to finish up with a few thoughts. So yeah, we touched on some really interesting topics related to neuroscience. I mean, I'm obviously pretty passionate about the brain, love talking about the brain. And, I think we touched around consciousness. We didn't get into the itty gritty, but honestly, like talking about the brain is basically, when I mentioned Daniel Dennett and the way the philosophers sit there and just look at the cell phone and look at the, that's consciousness emitting from the cell phone. The neuroscientists are like the cell phone engineers. We actually do care about what's on the inside, and we do want to know how it works. And can we explain all of it? No, I wouldn't say that that's the case. If that was the case, I wouldn't have a job. So, and that'd be true for so many neuroscientists. So there's a lot of questions we're still working on. So I'll just leave it there where if you hear people talking about like that somehow neuroscientists don't have explanations for just about every kind of human behavior, we at least have some idea on how it works at the very least. And for a lot of it, we have it really well worked out. So I will say that. And then we're only going to learn more and more. And honestly, as far as like skepticism or, humanism and atheism, I do feel like the neuroscience has the potential of being sort of the next target of the way evolution is for creation. That you're going to find more people who are pseudo skeptics or pseudo scientists attacking neuroscience, because we're going to start actually revealing even more information about the way the brain works in human beings. So it's going to be exciting times, and I'm prepared for it. So as far as my own work, we have I've got a bunch of stuff coming out relatively soon. Like one project that I'm really excited about, which is hopefully going to be coming out in a journal in the next month or so, is on how SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID, the way that innervates and the way that it gets into the nervous system. And so it's a lab that I collaborated with. It's got some really interesting data on how quickly it can get into the nervous system. This is all within rodents. So we still have to show it in humans, but those are kind of hard experiments to do in humans because we're looking at the very early stages of neuroinvasion, and it happens quick. It's on the order of around 18 hours that it can get into the nervous system. So much faster than anyone had anticipated. So that's some work that's coming out relatively soon. And then within the next month or so, I'm going to have a student who will be publishing a paper on how lead affects the brain and related to how thyroid hormone gets in the brain. And then, but as far as like, my more public persona, I do debates on, creation and evolution. That's a topic that I'm particularly interested in. My undergraduate degree was related to evolutionary biology. And, during the pandemic, I got more and more interested in getting back into like creation evolution issues. So I've been doing debates on Modern Day Debates, which is a kind of a relatively popular debate channel. And I have a debate coming tomorrow night, actually. So I'm going to be debating on intelligent design tomorrow night on Modern Day Debates, 8 p.m. Eastern. So anyone seeing this at that point, if you want to hear me go on more about, I guess, a completely different topic, I'll be duking it out there on Modern Day Debates. And you can go to my YouTube channel, which I put all kinds of content out on. I talk about the brain a fair amount. I also have videos on evolution. I have a whole series on the brain and the way it works from the systems and behavior perspective. These were lectures that I put together during the pandemic. That's the thing that kind of got me into YouTube. Is that is talking about the lectures that I was creating for my students. But then I started to get all kinds of comments and subscribers from all over the world, and it just became a thing. And now I'm like, I have a YouTube channel. So yes, so go ahead and check me out there. I will. I know there isn't a link with the associated with this video, but we'll have that up. So for anyone seeing this later, we'll definitely have that link. So.
Yep, we have the link. I know that Wes is going to be putting it up in the description.
I just dropped it in the side chat or in the live chat, so it's out there too. Go check Chris out. Check out his awesome channel and some content. He had some recent interactions with Aaron, who's always been a friend of Skeptic Haven over here. So we're glad you carved out some time for us. And just want to before we close out, I'm going to take a quick second just to thank our patrons here. We got Sydney Davis Jr., Eric Oslo. Hope I said that right. Tara S., Ryan, Deneen Murphy, Dan D., Michael Wiseman, Kathy Cotton, Cindy Plaza, Sunny Shell, Aaron Coalson, and Phil Calderone. I always get his name bad too.
Calderone.
Calderone.
Every time.
Because you put it at the end to trip me.
I know. We love you though. Well, and I want to tell everyone, if you continue to like this type of content like we do, if you get geeky like we do, remember to hit that bell, subscribe, share. Those are easy ways to promote this work. Don't forget to check out our other shows. We have Secular Soapbox on Wednesdays. The Bible Says What? The Sunny Spot on Thursdays. On Saturdays, you have the Global Atheist and Women Atheist Unload. And I'm on there as well sometimes, every once in a while. It's such an amazing show. And then our brand new Let's Talk, our call-in show, which is on Sundays. So we have something for everybody, so be sure and check all of that out. In the meantime, and until I see you again, remember to always think critically. Good night, everybody.